Get out! Sabrina needs your seat!
Still dressed for her father's funeral, Laurel Maddox stood on a deserted road as her husband threw her suitcase onto the asphalt. Her mother-in-law dropped her purse into the mud, and Trevor said her father had died, broke, leaving her nothing. Then he drove away with his mistress. What Trevor did not know was that the man they had just buried secretly owned a $1.2 trillion empire, and Laurel was his only daughter and sole heir. What would he do when the woman he discarded became the owner of everything he had ever wanted? If stories like this one stay with you, hit subscribe. Every week we bring you stories about people who were underestimated, written off, and left behind, and what happened next. Now let's get into it. Laurel Prescott grew up believing her father was a quiet man with a modest life. Conrad Prescott wore the same flannel shirts for years, drove a pickup truck older than most of her classmates, and fixed the roof of their small wooden house himself every spring with a bucket and a box of nails. The neighbors in Westbridge, Virginia assumed he was a retired warehouse manager. Laurel assumed the same. He never corrected her. What she knew was simpler and more important than the truth she didn't know. She knew he read to her every night until she was 12. She knew he made her solve the household budget every month at the kitchen table, not because they were struggling, but because he said a person who didn't understand money would always be controlled by someone who did. She knew he asked her every single year on her birthday the same question, "Do you know what you're worth?" And every year, when she named some accomplishment, a grade, a job, a skill, he'd shake his head gently and say, "That's what you've done. That's not what you're worth. Try again." She never got the answer right. He never told her she was wrong. She met Trevor Maddox in her junior year of college. He was the kind of man who filled a room, broad shoulders, easy confidence, the type who spoke first in every meeting and somehow made it seem natural. Laurel wasn't naive. She saw the ambition in him. But she also thought she saw something underneath it, something that wanted to build rather than just acquire. She was wrong about that, though it would take her 7 years to understand it. Before the wedding, Trevor's mother, Denise, sat Laurel down at the dining table of the Maddox family home and slid a document across the wood. A prenuptial agreement. Denise explained it calmly, almost kindly, the way someone explains a rule they've already decided you'll follow. The terms were straightforward. Any assets either party brought into the marriage or came to own in the future, including inheritance, remained solely theirs. The other spouse had no claim. Denise's reasoning was plain, even if she didn't say it outright. Laurel came from nothing. The Maddox family needed to protect what little they had from a woman who might one day want a share of it. Laurel signed without argument. She didn't see the point of fighting over money she didn't care about with people she was trying to love. Trevor kissed her on the cheek afterward and told her she was being mature. What neither of them understood, what no one in that room understood, was that the document Denise had designed to keep Laurel out had just permanently locked Trevor out of something neither of them knew existed. The marriage began well enough. Then it didn't. Trevor's ambitions outpaced his results, and he handled that gap the way some men do, by finding someone to blame for it. He told Laurel she wasn't sophisticated enough, that she had no useful connections, that her presence at company events made him look like he hadn't tried. When Denise moved into the house, the criticism stopped being private. Laurel's clothes were wrong. Her cooking was wrong. The way she spoke to Trevor's colleagues was wrong. The two of them built a language out of small humiliations, and they used it fluently. Then Sabrina Keaton arrived. She was a colleague of Trevor's, sharp, polished, the kind of woman who knew exactly how to make a man feel like the smartest person in the room. She started appearing at the house gradually, the way water finds a crack, until she was simply there, sitting in Laurel's chair, using Laurel's things. Wearing on one occasion a gold necklace Laurel recognized from her own jewelry box. Laurel saw it. She said nothing. She was still waiting for the man she'd married to come back. That was her mistake, and she would carry it for longer than she should have. Conrad was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer in the fall. Laurel drove to see him every week, sometimes twice. She sat beside his bed and read to him the way he had once read to her. She slept in the chair next to him on the nights when his pain was bad. Trevor never came. When she asked him once, he looked at her with something that wasn't quite contempt, but was close enough to it, and said he didn't have time to sit and watch a poor old man die. She didn't ask again. 2 days before the end, Conrad reached under his pillow and pulled out a dark blue envelope. The leather was soft and worn at the corners, like he'd handled it many times before deciding what to do with it. He pressed it into Laurel's hands and told her not to open it while she was still only grieving. He said to wait until the people around her had shown her who they really were. She tucked the envelope into her bag and held his hand until morning. He died on a Tuesday, quietly, the way he had lived. The funeral was small. Laurel arranged everything herself. Trevor agreed to drive her to the cemetery, though he arrived at the car with Denise on one side and Sabrina on the other, and none of them seemed to register that this was strange. Laurel got in. She looked out the window the whole way there and said nothing. On the drive back, Sabrina announced that sitting in the rear seat was making her nauseous. She needed to sit in front. Trevor pulled over. He didn't ask. He didn't explain. He got out of the car, walked to Laurel's side, and opened her door. His expression was the particular kind of calm that people wear when they've already made a decision and don't want to discuss it. "Get out," he said. "Sabrina needs your seat." Laurel looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped onto the road. Trevor walked to the trunk, pulled out her small suitcase, and threw it down onto the wet asphalt. He didn't look at her when he did it. Then he told her in the same even tone that she wasn't to come back to the house, that the marriage was over, that she had nothing coming to her. Denise climbed out long enough to throw Laurel's purse into the mud at the edge of the road. "Your father died without leaving you a cent," she said. "You've got no reason to hold on to my son anymore." The car pulled away. Laurel stood on the empty road in her funeral dress, her suitcase on the asphalt beside her, her purse in the mud. From a dark sedan parked 50 yards behind her engine. Running dashcam, rolling a man named Thomas Barlow, watched the whole thing. He was a quiet man with silver hair and the kind of stillness that comes from decades of knowing things other people don't. He picked up his phone and made a call. "They've shown her everything she needed to see," he said. "Begin the transfer." Laurel went back to her father's house. She sat in his reading chair for 3 days and waited, though she couldn't have said exactly what she was waiting for. Not Trevor, she knew better than that. Something older, maybe. Some version of her life that made sense. The only call she received was from Trevor's attorney. He wanted her signature on the divorce filing and her formal surrender of any claim to the marital home. Trevor, the attorney added, intended to remarry as soon as the process was complete. That was the moment something in Laurel settled. Not broke. Settled. The way a snow globe settles after it's been shaken too long, everything finally still and suddenly visible. She was still sitting there when a knock came at the door. Thomas Barlow introduced himself and asked if he could come in. He set a leather briefcase on the kitchen table and, without drama or preamble, began to explain what Conrad Prescott had actually been. Not a warehouse manager. Not a retiree with small investments. The founder, silent, anonymous, deliberately invisible, of Prescott Dominion Group, a private holding entity with subsidiaries operating across energy technology, transportation, pharmaceutical, manufacturing, and infrastructure development. Total audited value, $1.2 trillion. No photographs of Conrad existed in any public record. No corporate filing named him directly. The architecture of the company had been designed over 40 years to be untraceable back to a single man living in a wooden house in Westbridge, Virginia. Laurel sat across the table from Thomas and did not speak for a long time. He gave her the time. Then he told her that as Conrad's only child, she was the sole beneficiary of the estate, every trust, every share, every holding. The decision about what to do with it was hers alone. He told her she had 2 options. She could decline active control and allow the existing board of trustees to continue managing the group on her behalf. Or she could accept the inheritance in full and step into the role Conrad had always intended for her. Laurel reached into her bag and took out the blue envelope. The letter inside was in her father's handwriting, unsteady from illness, but deliberate in every word. He wrote that he had never hidden the money because he doubted her. He'd hidden it because he wanted her to grow up knowing her own value before anyone could attach a number to it. He wanted her to choose people who chose her when there was nothing obvious to gain. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the table. She took off her wedding ring and placed it squarely on top of Trevor's divorce filing. She looked at Thomas and said she would accept the inheritance. She would take control, but she would not become the kind of person who had just left her on that road. Thomas nodded as if he had expected exactly that answer. He opened the briefcase and began to work. Blackridge Estate sat behind iron gates at the end of a private road that didn't appear on any public map. The main house was large in the way that serious money tends to be, not showy, just permanent, built from stone and timber that had been chosen to last longer than anyone living in it. Conrad had run his entire operation from a study on the second floor, in a room lined with filing cabinets and overlooking a garden he never had time to tend. Laurel stood in the doorway of that room on her first morning there and understood for the first time the full weight of what her father had carried alone for decades. Thomas introduced her to the senior staff over the course of 2 days. Some of them were warm. Others were professionally courteous in the way people are when they're withholding judgment. A few didn't bother to hide their skepticism at all. One board member, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had served under Conrad for over 20 years, asked Thomas directly in Laurel's presence whether it might be prudent for her to take an advisory role while the existing leadership maintained operational control. He used words like transition period and institutional knowledge. What he meant was simpler: she was an unknown, and unknowns were a liability. Laurel didn't argue with him. She asked Thomas for access to the complete filing archive and spent the next 3 weeks reading every subsidiary report, every trust document, every board memo going back 15 years. She visited 2 manufacturing facilities without announcing herself in advance. She sat in the break rooms and talked to floor supervisors and line workers and asked what wasn't working. When she came back to Blackridge, she had a clearer picture of the company's structural weaknesses than most of the board had bothered to develop. Gerald Fitch stopped using the phrase advisory role after her second presentation. Conrad had never given Laurel the context for what he was teaching her, but he had taught her nonetheless how to read a room, how to follow money to its consequences, how to ask the question that no one in the meeting wanted to answer. She hadn't known why those lessons mattered. Now she did. While Laurel was working, Trevor was celebrating. He hosted a dinner for a group of friends and told them with visible relief that he'd finally cut loose the dead weight. He described his soon-to-be ex-wife as someone who'd held him back, who'd never understood his ambitions, who'd brought nothing useful to his life or his career. Sabrina sat beside him that night, already mapping out what came next. She had spent the better part of 2 years calculating the odds on Trevor Maddox passing on a position at another firm to stay close to a man she believed was going somewhere. She was ready for it to pay off. Neither of them was watching the news carefully enough. The annual stakeholder conference for Prescott Dominion Group was held in a downtown convention center in a hall large enough to seat several thousand people. It was by design the first such event ever open to press. Thomas had scheduled it that way. The decision had been made weeks earlier quietly by a woman in a wooden house in Westbridge who had just finished reading 15 years of board memos. Laurel walked onto the stage in a charcoal suit. No introduction from a publicist. No prepared warmth. Thomas stepped to the microphone and stated in plain language that Conrad Prescott had passed away and that full controlling interest in Prescott Dominion Group had transferred in its entirety to his sole heir. The screen behind Laurel lit up with her name and title. In the audience, cameras moved. In newsrooms across the country, producers interrupted scheduled programming. Within 20 minutes, the story was everywhere. The trillion-dollar empire, the secret founder, the daughter no one had ever heard of. Trevor saw it in a restaurant. He and Sabrina had ordered dinner, and he was midway through a story about a meeting he'd taken that afternoon when the television above the bar switched to a live broadcast. He recognized Laurel immediately. He recognized the set of her shoulders, the way she stood without fidgeting, the expression on her face that he had always mistaken for passivity, and was now understanding too late was something else entirely. The glass in his hand tipped. He caught it before it fell, but just barely. He called her number from the parking lot. The line clicked to a message telling him the contact was unavailable. He tried twice more on the drive. Same result. By the time he reached Blackridge Estate, he had convinced himself that a conversation was all this required. He was still technically her husband. The divorce wasn't finalized. That had to mean something. The security officer at the gate listened to his explanation without expression. Then she told him his name was not on the access list and asked him to back his vehicle out of the entry lane. Trevor told her he was Laurel's husband. The officer told him it didn't matter. He sat in his car outside those iron gates for a long time. It was the first door in his adult life that had been closed to him, not by circumstance, but by deliberate choice, her choice, and he had no way to argue with it. He found another approach. Within days, Trevor agreed to a sit-down with a media outlet that had been asking for comment. He was composed, measured, and carefully aggrieved. He said that he and Laurel had struggled in their marriage because of secrets she had kept from him. He implied that the concealment of her family's wealth had been a form of manipulation, that he had been denied the chance to make informed choices about his own life. He stopped just short of using the word trap, but the implication was clear. Denise appeared separately and told a morning program that the family had always loved Laurel like a daughter, that the incident on the road after the funeral had been a private disagreement blown out of proportion, and that she hoped the two young people could find their way back to each other. Then Trevor filed a legal claim. His argument rested on timing the asset transfer had occurred while they were still legally married, and therefore he was entitled to consideration under marital property law. His attorney was confident. Sabrina was confident. She had told herself the lawsuit was a formality, that a woman with $1.2 trillion would settle quickly and quietly rather than invite more press. She started keeping a list on her phone. Properties she liked. Cars she'd researched. It was, she told herself, just thinking ahead. Meanwhile, a faction within Prescott Dominion Group decided the moment was useful. 3 board members circulated a private memo suggesting that the ongoing media attention surrounding Laurel's personal life represented an unacceptable risk to the company's stability. They recommended a voluntary transfer of operational authority, temporary they called it, until the situation resolved. Gerald Fitch did not sign the memo, but he didn't stop it either. Laurel was being pulled from 2 directions at once. Her husband was in front of cameras calling himself a victim. Her own board was using his noise as a reason to question her fitness. And the public, which had spent 1 week treating her story as triumphant, was beginning to ask the version of the question that the media prefers. What had she known, and when, and why hadn't she told anyone? She kept working, but it was harder to stay steady. Then the video surfaced. It was a clip of less than 40 seconds taken at a company event months earlier. In the original footage, Laurel had been responding to a question about restructuring a dry exchange about departmental budget cuts that had included a passing reference to Trevor's division losing a contract. The edited version removed all context and kept only a fragment in which Laurel appeared to smile while his name was mentioned. It spread quickly. The board called an emergency session. 2 publicly traded companies with licensing agreements tied to Prescott subsidiaries saw their stock drop in a single afternoon. Gerald Fitch sent Thomas a message suggesting that Laurel voluntarily step back from public-facing decisions until legal matters settled. That same evening, Trevor held a press conference at the gates of Blackridge Estate. He stood in front of the cameras with the iron fence behind him and said that his wife owed him a conversation, that the marriage had not been dissolved, and that he would pursue every legal avenue available to him. Laurel watched the broadcast from her father's study. She turned it off before he finished. She sat in that room for a long time afterward, surrounded by Conrad's files, his handwriting on folder tabs, the particular quiet of a space that had held decades of decisions made alone. She thought about the factories she'd visited, the workers who didn't know her name but whose livelihoods ran through the decisions made in this room. She thought about what it would mean for all of that to become the backdrop of a prolonged public fight over a marriage that had already been over for years before Trevor bothered to end it officially. She pulled a sheet of paper toward her and began to write. She had the resignation halfway drafted when Thomas knocked and came in without waiting. He set a tablet on the desk in front of her. On the screen was a video file, Conrad's name in the title, the date recorded 3 months before he died. She pressed play. Her father looked directly at the camera with the particular stillness of a man who has chosen his words in advance. He said he knew there would come a moment when she would think that stepping away was the responsible choice, that walking back from the power she'd inherited would feel like protecting the people who depended on it. He told her that if she handed control to people who had never cared about those workers, those communities, those obligations, she wouldn't be protecting his legacy. She would be abandoning it. When the recording ended, Thomas reached into the briefcase he'd carried in and set a document on top of her unfinished resignation letter. It was the prenuptial agreement. The one Denise had slid across a dining table years ago. The one Laurel had signed without argument because she hadn't cared about money then and didn't see any reason to fight over it. She read through the relevant clause. The language was unambiguous. Both parties waived all claims to the other's separate property, including future inheritances. Trevor's attorney had drafted it. Trevor had signed it. The protection Denise had designed to keep a penniless girl away from her son's modest assets had been written broadly enough to exclude Trevor Maddox from every dollar Conrad Prescott had ever earned. He had locked himself out before the wedding. He had handed her the key without knowing there was a door. Laurel looked at the resignation letter under the prenuptial agreement. She picked up both pages. She tore the resignation in half, set the prenup back on the desk, and stood up. "Schedule the board vote," she told Thomas. "I'll be ready." The hearing was held in a mid-sized courtroom that smelled of old wood and recycled air. Trevor arrived with Denise on one side and his attorney on the other. He wore a dark suit and the expression of a man who had convinced himself through repetition that he was the wronged party in this story. Sabrina sat in the gallery behind him. She had dressed carefully for it. Thomas represented Laurel's interests at the plaintiff's table. He didn't speak much before the proceeding began. He didn't need to. Trevor's attorney opened by arguing that the asset transfer had occurred during an active marriage and that regardless of the prenuptial agreement's language, the circumstances warranted judicial review. He used phrases like inequitable concealment and asymmetric disclosure. The core of the argument was that Trevor had been denied information that would have materially affected his decisions about the marriage, about his career, about his life, and that this denial constituted a form of harm. It was a creative argument. Thomas let it finish without interruption. Then he presented 3 things. The first was the prenuptial agreement itself. He walked the court through the relevant language slowly and without editorializing. The document, drafted by Trevor's own legal team and signed voluntarily by both parties, contained an explicit waiver of any claim to separate property, including, in language that left no room for interpretation, property acquired through inheritance. Thomas noted that the agreement had been presented to Laurel before the marriage under pressure, with the stated purpose of protecting the Maddox family's assets from a woman they considered beneath them. The irony of its application, now he said, was the court's to appreciate. The second item was the divorce filing. Trevor had submitted it through his attorney before the Prescott Dominion Group conference, before the broadcast, before the story broke, before he had any knowledge of Laurel's inheritance. The filing was unambiguous in its terms. Trevor had sought to end the marriage and had explicitly waived any claim to shared assets in exchange for a clean and expedient process. He had signed it. His attorney had filed it. The date was on record. The third was a video file. Thomas turned a monitor toward the bench and pressed play. The dashcam footage was from Thomas's own vehicle, which had been running behind the Maddox SUV on the afternoon of Conrad's funeral. The angle was slightly elevated, and the resolution was adequate. It showed the car stopping. It showed Trevor getting out. It showed him opening Laurel's door, throwing her suitcase down onto the wet road, and leaving her standing there. It showed Denise throwing the purse into the mud. It showed the car driving away. There was no audio, It didn't require any. The courtroom was very quiet for a moment after the footage ended. In the gallery, Sabrina was no longer watching the monitor. She was looking at her hands. She had understood numbers long before she understood people, and the numbers here were finished. Whatever she had sacrificed to stay close to Trevor, the other position she hadn't taken the time she had spent. The calculations she had made, none of it was going to return anything. She had bet on a man who had managed to exclude himself from $1.2 trillion through his own paperwork, and she had nothing left to renegotiate with. During the recess, she stood up, collected her coat from the seat beside her, and walked out of the courtroom. She didn't say anything to Trevor on the way past. There was nothing useful to say, and she had never been the kind of person to speak without purpose. Trevor noticed she was gone when he turned around to look for her. He stood in the hallway during the break with his attorney and his mother, and that was when Denise began. She started quietly, but the hallway was not large. She told Trevor that she had warned him not about Laurel, but about the agreement. She said the language had been too broad, that she'd said so at the time, that no one had listened to her. Trevor told her she had been the one to insist on it. Denise said that wasn't how she remembered it. Their voices rose incrementally, the way family arguments do when there's no one left to perform composure for. 2 courthouse staff members walked past without making eye contact. Trevor's attorney arranged a brief private meeting between him and Laurel in a side room before the proceeding resumed. Laurel agreed to it. She stood near the window and waited while he worked out what he wanted to say. He told her he had made mistakes. He said it the way people say it when they mean they made mistakes and got caught with a heaviness that was about consequence rather than regret. He told her he still had feelings for her, that the version of them from the beginning, before things had gone wrong, had been real. He said he thought they could find their way back to something if she was willing. Laurel looked at him for a moment. Not with anger, with a kind of clear-eyed steadiness that had been developing in her since she'd sat in Conrad's kitchen and listened to Thomas explain who her father really was. "If my father had died with nothing," she said, "would you be standing here asking me to come back?" Trevor opened his mouth. The answer he needed, something that sounded like yes, something credible, didn't come. He searched for it and found only the truth, which was that he didn't know, which was the same as no. He said nothing. Laurel nodded once, the way you do when something you already understood is finally confirmed out loud. She thanked him for the conversation and walked back to the courtroom. The ruling came the following week. The court found in Laurel's favor on all points. The prenuptial agreement was enforceable as written. The divorce filing Trevor had submitted prior to any knowledge of the inheritance was accepted as a voluntary termination of marital claims. No portion of the Prescott estate, no trust, no shareholding, no property was accessible to Trevor Maddox by any legal mechanism he had not himself foreclosed. The board vote at Prescott Dominion Group was held 3 days later. Laurel won it, but the margin wasn't the story. The plan she presented was the story. She didn't stand up in that boardroom and talk about vision or legacy. She brought documents, specific proposals with timelines and budgets. 3 manufacturing facilities that had been flagged for closure would remain operational with a restructured cost model she had developed after visiting them herself. A scholarship fund for the children of hourly workers across the company's subsidiaries would be endowed and administered independently outside board oversight. A capital allocation toward hospital infrastructure and energy access in underserved communities. The kind of investment that would never produce a clean quarterly return, but that Conrad had quietly been making for years through subsidiary channels because he believed a company that ignored the places it operated in was borrowing time. She also proposed something that surprised most of the room, a partial disclosure of the company's ownership structure. Not full transparency, there were legal and competitive reasons to maintain certain arrangements, but enough to end the culture of deliberate invisibility that Conrad had used as protection and that others, or Mosfos, had learned to use as leverage. Finally, she announced the formation of the Conrad Prescott Foundation, which would direct resources toward the same principles her father had operated by for 40 years, quietly, without credit, and with attention to the people most institutions overlooked. Gerald Fitch, who had questioned her fitness to lead in her first week, voted in favor of all 5 proposals. He didn't apologize for his earlier skepticism. She hadn't expected him to and didn't need it. The consequences for the others arrived without Laurel's help. Trevor's employer conducted an internal review after his lawsuit became public and found that he had used company relationships and resources in connection with his personal legal strategy. He was let go within a month of the ruling. The severance was minimal. The professional community he'd spent years trying to impress is a small one, and the story had been well covered. Denise lost the position she'd held on the board of a local civic organization after the dashcam footage circulated fully online. The members hadn't seen the original clip. They saw the unedited version, the purse thrown into the mud, the car driving away, and drew their own conclusions without needing to be guided toward them. Sabrina moved on efficiently, the way she did most things. Within a few months, she had accepted a position genuinely qualified for, at a firm that had nothing to do with Trevor or Prescott. She had made a bad bet, and she recalibrated. It was not the most sympathetic arc, but it was an honest one. Laurel did nothing to accelerate any of it. She made no calls. She gave no background comments to journalists. She simply stopped using her energy to manage the fallout of other people's choices, and the fallout managed itself. A year after the funeral, on the morning of the Prescott Havens opening, Laurel drove to Conrad's house alone. She let herself in with the key she still kept on her regular key ring, between her car key and the key to Blackridge. The house was exactly as Conrad had left it. She hadn't changed anything, not the rug in the front hall, not the row of hooks by the door, where he'd hung his work jackets, not the stack of books on the side table that he'd never finished. She sat in his reading chair in the early morning light and let herself think. She thought about the road, about the particular quality of the air that afternoon, cold and flat, the kind that comes after rain, about the sound of the SUV pulling away, the engine note fading, and then nothing. She remembered that she hadn't cried right away. She had stood there in her funeral dress and tried to understand what had just happened to her life, and the understanding hadn't come cleanly. It came in pieces over months, in the middle of board meetings and late nights in her father's study. The full understanding, what she had lost and what she had escaped, took longer still. She didn't think of that day as the worst thing that had happened to her anymore. She thought of it as the last thing that had happened to her before she began. She stood up, locked the house, and drove to the road. The Prescott Haven occupied a low, wide building set back from the road behind a small parking area and a line of trees that someone had planted thoughtfully for privacy. The exterior was plain, and the sign above the entrance was modest, dark letters on a light background. Nothing that announced itself to people who weren't looking for it. That had been intentional. The women who came here were not in most cases in a position to walk through a door that felt like a public declaration. The building was designed to feel like somewhere you could arrive quietly. It offered temporary housing, legal consultation, and employment placement services. The funding came from the Conrad Prescott Foundation and was structured to run independently without requiring annual board approval. It would continue whether or not Laurel was involved in the day-to-day operations of the larger company. She hadn't built it as a monument to what had happened to her on this road. She had built it because she had stood alone in a funeral dress with no clear next step, and she had been lucky in ways that had nothing to do with her own strength. She'd had a father who had quietly prepared her for a world she didn't know was waiting. Not every woman standing in that position had someone who had done that for them. The opening was small. Local staff, a few community partners. Thomas was there. Gerald Fitch sent a note that was brief and genuine. Laurel spoke for less than 10 minutes, said what needed to be said, and let the building speak the rest. That evening, she went back to Conrad's house. In the small reading room off the main hallway, she had placed a simple glass frame on the wall. Inside it was the dark blue envelope. Below the frame, on a strip of cream-colored card, she had written 2 lines. "He never hid my worth, only my wealth." She sat on the front porch as the evening came in the chair Conrad had always used, looking out at the driveway, where his old pickup truck still sat under the oak tree. She hadn't moved it. She wasn't sure she ever would. The year had given her many things: authority, resources, a platform large enough to matter. It had also cost her things that didn't have a financial equivalent: time, privacy, the particular piece of being a person no one was watching. But she understood now what her father had understood for decades: that the question he'd asked her every birthday wasn't a riddle. It was the practice of returning to it, of refusing to let the answer be supplied by someone else. Trevor had thrown her out of a car because he believed she had nothing. He had been so certain of that belief that he had signed documents enshrining it, had said it to her face on a public road, had built his idea of his own future on it. He had been wrong, in a way that $1.2 trillion had made impossible to ignore. But Laurel knew the way she knew most important things, quietly, and without needing to say it aloud, that he had been wrong before the money. He had been wrong on the first day he looked at her and saw only what she lacked. She had stopped needing him to see it. That was the moment she had won. Not in any courtroom, not on any stage. The moment on the road, when she picked up her suitcase and chose to walk forward instead of wait for someone to turn the car around. Laurel Prescott didn't win because she inherited $1.2 trillion. She won the moment she stopped asking a cruel man to recognize her value. And that's the part no amount of money can buy: knowing you are worth something before the world decides to show you the proof. If this story meant something to you, we'd love to have you stay. Subscribe to the channel. Every week we share stories about people who were left behind, written off, or underestimated, and what they did next. You never know which story might be exactly what someone you love needs to hear today.